So let's talk about the structure of the actual lists. From preliminary to grade 6 is all the same. Extra list requirements only take place from grades 2 to 6, and it's 2 extra songs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Preliminary to grade 6 has list A, B and C with those 2 extra list songs for grades 2 to 6. List A is, and I know that these are strange, but list A is a legato line, pure and even tone. We decided not to structure the early grades based on time periods, but rather on style. And a couple of people on the committee felt very strongly, as I do, about one whole list devoted to that idea of a beautiful legato line. You might say, why on earth would you devote an entire list to that? Well, I hear a lot of singers, a lot. And I'm very fortunate that I spend most of my day listening to singers all over the place, all over the country, overseas. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that I'm deeply concerned that one of the things that we are losing in vocal technique is that ability to sing one pure, beautiful line all the way through that is uncomplicated. It is absolutely getting lost. So we wanted to state that really clearly and say that we think that that's important. We think that the ability to sing a pure legato line without any inflections or weirdness or whatever, with pure, beautiful, even tone is important. So all of the repertoire that you'll see in List A has that at its heart. Does that mean that text isn't important? Not a chance. Does that mean that character isn't important? Of course not. But what we are really looking for in these List A pieces is that sense of that beautiful legato line. List B, complete change, character song, text, lots of patter songs, fast text, where the characters are larger than life. And while absolutely the musical elements are important, the driving force here is really the character and the text work. That's really what we're looking to hear and see from the candidates. List C, contemporary popular musical theatre. Well, that's really there for those students who come into your lessons, and I'm sure you all have them, as I do, who say, I really want to sing Wicked. I really want to sing Defying Gravity from Wicked. And you say, yes, great, not today. But we've thrown in a whole list of contemporary, so the stuff that's being written right now that your students are listening to, that they like, that they know. Absolutely. We want them to enjoy the singing and to come back. There's no point if they're not in the room. So we want them in the room and we want them to come back. And so this list is entirely devoted to that. It says contemporary popular because some things in that list are very old. They're certainly not contemporary, but they're standards or they've been around for a very long time and are very popular. So that's that entire list. And that list is really a mixture of both legato things or things that are character-based or whatever. You would be wrong to assume that everything in List A is a ballad. That's not true. There are some up-tempo things in there, but that legato line is paramount. Same with List B. There's ballads in there, but that text and the driving force of the text and the character is paramount. So that's preliminary to grade 6. And then we make a fairly dramatic shift at grade 7, and we do go into a more structured, time-based study from grade 7 and up. Musical theatre falls into nice categories, and I'm going to talk about that now. List A, that pre-1940s repertoire. This is really important. I can't tell you how many students come to me first year of study at tertiary and they've never sung anything pre-1940 or pre-1960. And so there's masses, as you would know, there's masses of this gorgeous repertoire with beautiful melodies, especially from that sort of, that 1920s and 30s period, the Noel Coward and Harold Arlen and Hoagie Carmichael, and all these composers that have written these beautiful melodies that our singers don't often get the chance to experience because it's not familiar to them and they don't know about it, and we want to expose them to that beautiful repertoire. And certainly if they're talking grade 7, we expect them to really begin to have a holistic study of musical theatre and understand everything that's taken place in the last century. So an entire list devoted to that. I want to mention that a lot of that repertoire is quite easy on the page. It's certainly much easier than grade 7 on the page, fairly basic. But a lot of the arrangements that I've chosen are much more complicated arrangements, really from that sort of cabaret circuit that a lot of musical theatre performers regularly performing, that's very popular in Australia. And so we're expecting those arrangements, and even further than that, where we haven't given a complicated arrangement, we're expecting the performers to really begin to develop their own performance of that piece and create their own version of that piece. List B, and here's where it starts to get slightly complicated. It says there 1940 to 1967, which is a slightly weird date. It technically should be 1943 to 1967. Why 1943? Sorry? No. What happened in 1943 in musical theatre? Yes, Oklahoma. Well done. Who said that? Yes, you get to be the star of the day. Yeah, okay, I'm glad you're happy about that. Oklahoma, absolute landmark moment, the opening night of Oklahoma. You guys should read some of the audience reactions that are available online to the opening night of Oklahoma. They're really quite moving. Why was it so significant? Yep, so it was book musicals. It's that, but there's something else that's even more significant. Yeah, well, there was certainly that, but we were dealing with serious subject matter for the first time. It wasn't not that there's anything wrong with that. That's lovely, but it was serious subject matter. So it really created a shockwave in the musical theatre community, and people were incredibly excited about that. So we had Oklahoma in 1943, and really when we're talking about the end of the golden age, we are really talking about 1964 and a particular show. If I was a rich man, Fiddler. So Fiddler is technically the end of the golden age, but here's what's really important, and I fully concede that you could pick up a text and it will contradict what I'm saying to you. I acknowledge that. But I'm right. No, the truth is that most industry people agree with what I'm about to tell you, but I do concede that there are others out there that have a different point of view, but most musical theatre experts agree with what I'm about to tell you. So I will make clear to the examiners that some flexibility in this is absolutely warranted, and I understand that. But when we are talking about Golden Age, even though I've given you dates just then, we are really actually talking about composers and that whole idea of the book musical. And these are the composers. When we are specifically talking about Golden Age composers, we are talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, Bernstein, Comden and Green, Cole Porter, but Only Kiss Me Kate, Only Kiss Me Kate, Frank Lesser, Irving Berlin, Lane and Harburg, and Harnick and Bach. So here we've put Golden Age plus additional composers, because we're really looking at it in terms of the time period, and we acknowledge that there are composers in there that aren't those technical Golden Age composers, or the shows that we've picked aren't necessarily book musicals, but it's that entire period. 1968 was the next sort of significant thing that happened. What happened in 1968? Hair. Well done. Who said that? You're the news star of the day. Sorry. It comes, it goes. Hair, absolutely. A really significant moment in musical... I mean, the whole world was in flux, but a significant moment in musical theatre, that introduction of rock music. People were listening in a new way, and I was going to say excited, but I felt like I was going to give you a Sondheim line, excited and scared, about where musical theatre was really heading, with these influences of rock and pop and even gospel sort of making its way in. And so we still had people who were trying to hold on to the past and didn't want to let go of those delicious book musicals and stories, but it really being forced into new directions. And very quickly after Hair, we had Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar and all these shows that were incredibly different, and taking musical theatre in a new, scary but interesting direction. The difficulty for musical theatre is that from the late 70s, early 80s, the early 80s especially, late 70s, was probably the most difficult period for musical theatre. The fewest amount of new works were written during that period. There was very little being written. And in fact, the entire Broadway community was in a great amount of change. Lots of theatres were closing down. Audience numbers were at their lowest point in the late 70s, early 80s. We had videos and people were saying, you know, why would I go to a theatre when I can have a video at home and I can go to the movies and see things there? Why should I go to a live production? So audience numbers were at their lowest. Theatres were falling into disrepair. Lots of theatres were closing or being sold off. And around that Times Square area, for those of you that have been to New York, that entire sort of precinct went through an enormous change. Other than theatres closing down, all the shops in that area suddenly were sex shops and tobacconists and tattoo parlours, and the whole area became quite seedy. And in the mix of all of that, there were a few theatres still sort of struggling along. So in the early 80s, despite Cats in 1982, it was a very depressed period in musical theatre. It's difficult when you're putting a syllabus together. When you get to that period, you're really scratching around to find great repertoire in amongst this period. But then towards the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a significant change. And I'm not sad to say it, but it is what it is. But we owe it all to Disney. And I'm going to tell you why. It's really interesting. Disney had Beauty and the Beast, which was really their first show, and it was huge on Broadway. They were concerned during Beauty and the Beast that they had mum and dad arriving with their two little-ears, and they'd have to walk past the sex shops and the tattoo parlours and the tobacconists on their way in to see Beauty and the Beast. They wanted to stage Lion King, and they wanted to do that at the New Amsterdam Theatre on 42nd Street, which was very run down, and the entire area around there was pretty awful. So they put to the Mayor Giuliani, that they would buy the New Amsterdam Theatre, and not only would they renovate the theatre, but they would renovate the entire area around the New Amsterdam Theatre in that strip of 42nd Street for several blocks. If he would guarantee that all of those establishments, the sex shops and the tobacconists and tattoo parlours, if he would get rid of all of those shops from Times Square. So he made them a guarantee that he would do that. They invested $32 million, which was a lot of money at this stage, and they not only bought the theatre and renovated it, but they rejuvenated the entire area around there. That act had a ripple effect across all of Broadway. Theatres were being renovated right across the area. All of the establishments were changing in that area, and Broadway and Times Square, for those of you that have been there recently, of course, it's a very different place now than what it was in the late 70s, early 80s, and we really do owe that initial change to Beauty and the Beast and the Lion King and $32 million from Disney, which does make an enormous difference. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's really fascinating that just something like that can have such a profound effect on that wider community. The result then was that, and you'll see in the repertoire, towards the late 80s, and not so much, but certainly the early 90s, all this new writing starts taking place, and lots of new composers really come forward, and we get masses of these new shows off Broadway, becomes incredibly vibrant as Broadway itself. So there's masses of this new repertoire. So that's that period leading up to 1999. And of course, we had the emergence of the jukebox musical during all of that. Mercifully, I kind of feel like we're done with the jukebox musical thing. I think that's over, to which everybody said hallelujah. And then in 2000 to 2015, contemporary musical theatre, and really the beginning of this new style called film to stage, which is very popular at the moment, taking a successful film, turning it into a musical. Most new shows tend to be of that genre, and I don't say that like it's a good thing, it is what it is, but that film to stage is kind of where we are at right now. List D will also include Australian musical theatre, and we felt very strongly about the inclusion of Australian musical theatre. You might be thinking, trying to think in your head, I'm trying to name Australian musical theatre, and you're probably struggling. There's masses of it out there that is extremely, extremely good writing. And when I started work on this, of all the things that I had to do in the syllabus, this was by far the most challenging aspect of putting the syllabus together. It wasn't that I couldn't find Australian repertoire, I could find masses of it, but none of it was in print. And I couldn't get any of it to you. If I didn't put it in the grade book, there was no other way of me getting it to you without you having to contact the composer themselves, and then maybe in 3 months' time the composer might get back to you, and as I've done, and this slightly illegal trade of these scores happening, which I'm sure none of you were involved in, but people having all this illegal scores at their disposal because just wasn't in print and you couldn't get it anywhere else. So I went through the process of contacting as many Australian composers as I could, and trying to come up within my own mind a way to fix this problem. And I spoke to the AMEB about it, the federal AMEB about it extensively. I'm deeply indebted to Stuart Hendricks at Hal Leonard, and many of you know that I was the advisor at Hal Leonard for more than 10 years, and so I know the crowd down there really, really well, and I consider them my friends. And so I went to Stuart and I said, this is my problem, how can I fix this? And we both thought long and hard about how we could do it, and so essentially we went to the Australian composers with a few options. The first option was that you could develop your own website, and like Matthew Robinson, for those of you that know Matthew Robinson's work, you could do that and develop your own website, which does cost a bit of money, and have the pieces there which people could purchase and download. The second option was that you could align your work with a major company like musicnotes.com. You could, again, sort of fairly substantial financial outlay to make that happen, but you could put all of your music on there, and several of our composers opted to go in that direction. The last option, which happened almost by accident, which I think is incredibly significant, is that two young guys, recent graduates from the musical theatre program at WAPA, decided to develop their own site of musical theatre called Homegrown Oz. And as a consequence to that, they started to encompass or draw in other composers. So I'm sure many of you that are musical theatre nerds like me would know about the new musical theatre website in the States, yes? So this is actually a very similar site to that, and I'll have a screen coming up in a little bit about that to show you how you can access that site. But now they are developing a site very similar to the new musical theatre website with masses of new material. It's still in formulation, so it's still quite new, but I'll show that and explain it more in detail. But this is what's actually quite exciting, that we're going to see lots of new young Australian writers writing material that your students that are serious about musical theatre will be exploring and will want to sing. So I'm delighted that lots of that material is here. Every single level of the syllabus has Australian material in there that you can access and you can purchase. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So I'm very proud of that. In grades 7 and 8, you sing one song from each list plus one additional song from lists A, B, C or D. You might say, why didn't we just make that an extra list? where a student could choose whatever they wanted of the same grade level and sing that. It's a really good reason. There are 1,500 songs in the syllabus from 450 musicals. If I haven't put it in the syllabus, I didn't like it, or there wasn't anything else out there. So the syllabus is extremely comprehensive and large. The lists are large, and we wanted students to draw from that. So for the certificate, associate and licentiate, that's the same, except that you're developing a full program. You have to have covered at least one song from each list, and then you are able to devise a program from any of the lists, but based on what is there. And as I said, the lists are extensive.